Blog Talk Radio.
Well, here we go, ladies and gentlemen, across this great country. If it's Tuesday, it's Cleveland, Ohio, front and center. And the host, Peter Ray, American Sports History Podcast. Yours truly, Mark Mancini, producing this thing. 347-205-9631. And if you miss it, catch the archive, blogtalkradio.com/Mancini Sports, and all the podcast platforms powered by Mancini Media. So without further ado, let me lay the red carpet down. Let me put the podium in its place and hand off the mic. First of all, Peter, how are you? Second of all, how can people get a hold of you? Third of all, you brought Dixie to the forefront in this great show, my friend.
Hi, Mark. I'm fine. I'm doing very well. I have a YouTube channel. It's history videos and a lot of Cleveland baseball. The title of the name of the channel is my name, Peter J. Ray, R-E-A. And you're absolutely right about tonight's guest. He's a play-by-play commentator for Mercer University on ESPN3. He's a huge Atlanta sports talk talent, sports journalism, and he's also a commentator, podcast host, and writer. And the amazing thing is goes to Georgia College. He's second-year college, so it's hard to believe that a guy this young has been doing so much and has such a bright future in sports journalism. Our guest tonight is Luke Winstel. Are you there, Luke?
Yes, I'm here. How are you doing?
Oh, good. I'm fine. Thanks so much for coming on the show. So, Luke, can you tell us about your blooming career in sports journalism?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the intro and the kind words. But for me, really, it just has started out with having a good support system. I've been really lucky to have a lot of very supportive friends and family along the way, people helping me try to get opportunities, boost up my name a little bit. But just very grateful for the support that I've had. I wouldn't have been able to do it without everybody else around me.
You're today is my 61st birthday, which that reminds me of Roger Maris, 61 home runs in 1961. Sports is full of numbers and hitting 300, scoring 20 points a game in basketball, average of 4 yards a carry in football. And I think of Atlanta, I think of 715 home runs and 755 home runs. And, the baseball world lost a very important person, and the city of Atlanta lost a very important guy as well. Can you tell us what does Henry Aaron mean to the city of Atlanta?
Well, I can tell you, from my perspective, it's a little bit unique because I've, of course, like you mentioned, being in college, come from a younger generation. So what I hear is the stories of the older generation that, like my dad, went to the game where Hank Aaron broke the record. So I hear the stories now, and I get to – my only view of Hank Aaron has been formulated by the stories I've heard and some of the tapes that I've seen. So from my perspective, I've gotten a really good look at the legacy that Hank has left on the culture of our city in Atlanta, but of course nationally, internationally as well. So you look at the types of things that people say. The first thing that comes to mind about Hank Aaron when I ask people and hear the stories of everybody around the city, talking to people that maybe worked as people in the ticket booth at those games, things like that I've had conversations with. And I'll tell you first off, of course, he's a first-class human being, one of the best, nicest people you could ever meet, such a classy guy. But when you get into it and what Hank meant to the culture of Atlanta, he's part of the lifeblood of this city. He was before he passed. And hearing these things about his legacy, seeing how it goes strong, naming streets after him, constantly the Braves making him the center of a lot of their organizational efforts as they got towards the end of his life, was really a lot of fun to watch. It was interesting for someone like me to grow up and have a role model like Hank Aaron. He's always been my favorite baseball player. So it's been a really cool opportunity to see the last years of his life play out in Atlanta and what he was able to do, and how even in his old age he was able to have such a big impact on this city and the community around it.
You know, the being a sports fan is a tough deal. We all want to win championships, and the odds are bad every year, especially now with expansion, about 30 teams per in each sport, and the major sport. And Cleveland has not won a World Series since 1948, so that's 73 years. I became a fan in 1973. Again, you see how these numbers keep popping up. 1995, Cleveland made it to the World Series, first time in 41 years. And we had a very tough, very strong team, but we lost in 6 to the Atlanta Braves. Now, the Braves played in 5 World Series between 1991 and 99, in the 90s. And lost 4 out of 5. So actually, I was thinking, and that the '95 Braves are the only of the 4 major sports, the only Atlanta. That's the only Atlanta title. It's too bad. I don't imagine last year they were able to celebrate the 25th anniversary. What do the 1995 Atlanta Braves World Series champions team? What does that team mean to Atlanta?
Well, when you look around, of course, that was the first title that we had in Atlanta. It was the stories that I hear are the abysmal sports history of my parents when they were younger. My mom grew up in Atlanta. They were season ticket holders for the Falcons, and they would go and sit in the snow and watch these terrible games, and the teams would just get killed. Atlanta kind of had a bit of a Loserville vibe from what I gather. It's like, you know, you go around, you're getting beat pretty good, you're maybe third place in your league at best in your division. And that 1995 team for Atlanta was the team that finally broke through. Of course, when you look back on the 90s, a lot of people think disappointment. There should have been more. When you have the big 3, talent, there should have been more. But you look at 95 as something that has never been forgotten. You look around and people are still collecting, and sports collecting, trying to get the autographs and the sports cards from that team, because of how iconic it was. You look at that collection of talent, especially the pitching. I feel like a lot of people in Atlanta, as a sports culture, tend to favor teams that are good pitching rather than good hitting, because what they're used to is a team built off of the big 3 and the type of Cy Young talent that Atlanta had year in, year out, 1 through 3 in their rotation, and, of course, a good bullpen to back it up. You look around at that, and it's still really big. People still talk about some of these guys, they're local legends, get recognized a good bit even 25, 26 years later at this point. So in Atlanta, it still means a lot, but right now, of course, with the talent the Braves have in the present, it's saying, okay, that was cool, but it's time for another one. We're a top 10 market in the MLB. It's time to spend like it. It's time to play like it. It's time to break through again with the talent we do have.
You know, in life has winning and losing, and sports obviously had the same thing. And 1954, Cleveland had a tremendous year in baseball, won 111 games, winning percentage over 700, and we got swept in the World Series 4-0. I don't think Cleveland's ever got over that you could say trauma. Now, as a sports fan, I root for the underdog. That's my philosophy. I always root against the teams that have won many championships. So in the Super Bowl from the 2016 season, I don't know what the number Super Bowl 51. That was a class. It was an easy Super Bowl for me. I was rooting hard, very hard for the Falcons. Never won a Super Bowl, and then here you got the title gorge Patriots, and that had to be, you know. And see, I'm not even a Falcons fan. That was such a painful game, and I would say, you know, and it hurt me. It hurt me, and I thought, you know, the Atlanta fans really have. That was a terrible experience, and talk about being wounded as a sports fan. How is Atlanta doing regarding that? Now, it hasn't been that long. It's been about going on 5 years, and I sure hope that Atlanta can get over that. But do you want to talk about how tough tough that was, and how tough it's been, how things are going since then in terms of getting over that.
Well, the hope immediately afterwards was like, okay, fine, that was really hard. But the idea was, okay, this football team is still good. We've got Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, you name it. We've got it. The defense actually came together for that one season. And the idea was, okay, well, let's just run it back. But the Super Bowl hangover has been real. I will tell you one thing about that year. Throughout the season, that was my first season covering the Falcons week to week. And we had a podcast covering Atlanta sports, me and my cousin. And that was a real focus for us. It was like, okay, the Falcons have drafted well. That 2016 draft class was a piece of absolute artwork. And that set the team up to make that deep run the way they did. I mean, you're blowing out the Green Bay Packers like it's nothing in the NFC Championship. And it's like, whoa, got everybody on notice, including Tom Brady. We sent a message in that game. Put up over 40 points on Green Bay, and Aaron Rodgers never looked like he could even compete in that game. He was on his heels. Matt Ryan vastly outplayed him, and that's not even really up for debate. So the city, throughout the season, was building. You had a couple of tough losses in the regular season where you say, okay, the team's good, but hold on. This is a little concerning. I think it was the Kansas City loss that was like, okay, can we get over the hump against a big team like that? And you get towards the end of the year and you walk around the city downtown, all of a sudden everybody's wearing Falcons jerseys. It's like everybody's wearing the red and the city's getting passionate. When you walk into a store or you walk around, like one of the first conversation topics that was coming up is the Atlanta Falcons. And those are two things that are not really that normal for Atlanta. I don't know how much you know about the city, but it's really a city of transplants. A lot of people have moved in from elsewhere. A lot of people from New York, especially. My dad's one of them. My dad's from Buffalo. But a lot of people have moved in, so there's not a ton of overall loyalty considering how big the city is to the specific Atlanta sports teams compared to, for example, Boston. I mean, so loyal to their team, even though they've got a lot of people moving in and out, they've kept a very strong fan base. For Atlanta, it's a little bit more fair-weathered, but the city really heated up, and I've never seen passion in our city for a sports team like that. Maybe Atlanta United, but that was not close to what we saw for the NFL in 2016. So you take a look around at the vibe in the city. Everybody's throwing huge Super Bowl parties. Every car lined up. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And then you've got the game. Of course, like it all builds up to the game. The fan fests and everything going on. Everybody was so into it. And here's my embarrassing story. I haven't shared this publicly, but I was in high school at the time, and I was I had heard rumors on Twitter that if the Falcons won, their championship parade was going to be on Wednesday. So in the third quarter, when it's 28-3, I was crafting an email to the principal and to the attendance office of my school telling them I was not going to be able to make school that day because I'm going to the parade because this Super Bowl will be the first championship an Atlanta sports team has won in my life. And I was going to try to get an excused absence out of class for that. And, of course, as I finished crafting that email during the commercial breaks, as we go through the game, we all of a sudden go to overtime, and the Falcons blow it, and I had to delete the email, along with a few tweets. I had some very confident tweets in that third quarter as well. But that was a heartbreaking game, and for me, and I think a lot of young fans, and this Generation Z, as they call it, that was a wake-up call for us to say, okay, like in sports, it's never over. Like you actually, it's not just a cliche. Like that was where it hit me of like, oh, it never is done until it really is done. So that is something that seems simple, but when it hits you, it'll really get you.
Yeah, I hope the city can. I think that the mistake, the pitfall you can get into is sort of indulging in, this in the painful memory and what if, and hopefully you can see good in that year. because they're obviously, you get to the Super Bowl, that these teams deserve respect. I love the quote by John Smoltz after the Braves won in '95, and he was frustrated because they'd lost a couple times in the early '90s against Toronto, I believe, and it's like, oh, you guys are losers. You lose if you lose the Super Bowl. You're not a loser. We have to. Our attitude is so important. So I hope that in Atlanta they can do that and have a positive attitude about the year instead of, it's our choice how we think about things. There's always there's good and bad in everything, but it's important to see good, and I hope the city can do that too. Because otherwise, if you don't, then it just becomes this curse that creates more failure. And so I wish you well with that challenge.
Thank you. It's one of those things where, being in Atlanta, the culture down here is obviously very football focused in the South. And in the South, one thing you might find a little different is a lot of the attention here is a little more focused on college football than NFL in general. So you've got pretty much everyone in the States, except for your people here and there that are Georgia Tech fans, Georgia State, or a different school. Most of the people in Georgia that are football fans are going to root for UGA. And UGA, for the past decade, has been blowing some big games. You've got the Falcons blow the Super Bowl. The Braves blow a couple of series in the playoffs. And then all of a sudden, you've got this kind of Atlanta sports curse brewing. People around the city are like, I don't know if we'll ever see us get one. And our MLS soccer team did it. It's not a world championship. They won. That was really good for the city. A lot of people love soccer here. It's a big growing sport in Atlanta. But outside of that, when you look at the big sports, the Atlanta Hawks, too, like you get into the series playing LeBron and the Cavaliers, and you're getting swept every time. And it's like, okay, no matter what we do, are they going to be able to pull it together in the playoffs? Is there an Atlanta sports curse? So that is kind of an attitude for some people with the way things have gone lately.
Georgia Bulldogs. Have they won a college football title?
Not since 1980, but in the 1980s was their last one.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to bring up the Hawks next. They've never made it to the finals, and tough in 2015. Winning percentage of .732, really good. Number one in the East, and got swept in the East Finals by Cleveland. And yes, I mean at the time I remember thinking, I'm rooting for Cleveland, but I'm thinking, boy, this is tough. You guys are when you're ranked number one, and then of course sweeps are tough. And do you want to talk about the 2015 Hawks?
That is one of my favorite sports memories, that team. I was at the time playing Division III Academy soccer, and every time I would get back from my practices at night, first thing I would do, turn on Atlanta Hawks radio, Steve Holman on 92.9 The Game. He's probably top 3 commentator in the NBA right now. He's incredible on the radio. And we'd put him on, and we would listen to the Hawks on the way home. We'd get home, turn the TV on, and then you just watch that team play. That's where I really fell in love with basketball, I think, as a sport. I'd always played, but I'd never loved watching it the way that I learned to love it that year. And the reason I loved it is because of the brand of basketball that Atlanta played back then. You have a lot of guys that contribute, but no superhero. You didn't have a superstar. That's what ended up costing the team. That's what the Hawks have now in Trae Young that they didn't have before. But you had no super team basketball. Coach Bud, Mike Budenholzer, has got the team making the extra pass. They're unselfish. They're well coached. It's a diverse team. Guys are from all over. So everybody had a different personality. So there was a player on the team for everybody that you could say is your favorite player. And you don't see that a ton in the NBA. But it seemed like the way that offense was structured, you're either going to make something happen immediately early in the shot clock, or you dish it out to Kyle Korver. And Kyle Korver has been my favorite player because he really transcended that Hawks team to the next level because of the way he was shooting a three. had a huge streak of making a three-pointer across however many consecutive games. And it seemed like Kyle was rarely cold that season. He was just automatic, fun to watch, beautiful stroke. Kyle Korver was the type of guy, he doesn't have a name like Steph Curry, but he's somebody you show up to watch in warm-ups. Someone like me that at the time was trying to learn how to shoot better, I would show up to games to watch the Hawks play, come an hour early or an hour and a half early when the gates opened, just to watch his stroke, to watch him shoot. That year, he was electric. And that Hawks team, everybody had a player that they could love on that squad. And they put together the wins. They had that month of January. I think they won like 19 games in that month. Might have been a streak of 19 even. But the way that team really got things going again for Atlanta, the first time in a little while that we'd seen the Hawks team really get that 70-plus win percentage. And now the Hawks are starting to light things back up again, but they're deeply embedded in that downtown Atlanta culture. A lot of people really want the Hawks to succeed, to be a big part of the culture. And we saw it then. We're beginning to see it again, and that's something that can really light things up in Atlanta sports is when the Hawks are getting rolling.
And the hockey team, the Thrashers, any thoughts on that team and their history?
Yeah, with the Thrashers, that was a really cool thing we had for about a decade and a half, almost 2 decades, I think. Close to, well, about a decade and a half of the Thrashers. They left, of course, in 2011, and that was a heartbreaker for everybody. But having them in the NHL was a lot of fun because we'd had that Flames team leave, now they're in Calgary, and we finally got that other hockey team. Like, I'm looking at myself right now. I've got statues of all the Thrashers players that they put out. I was a big fan of that team. And I felt like right as they were beginning to get going, they left. And that was always one of those, like, what could have been. Now in Atlanta, it's like Atlanta right now is a top 10 media market. Could we get another team? Like, wouldn't the NHL be smart to give us another team? For a lot of people, they chalk it up to bad management, not lack of interest or support of the team. It was just not managed very well, especially at the end of their tenure. So it'd be really cool to have somebody, a motivated owner, investor, something like that, to get a team back in Atlanta, be really into it, have a well-managed Atlanta hockey team, and I think it would do very well.
So, and what do you mean? What would happen to the Thrashers?
Well, the Thrashers left in 2011 and became the Winnipeg Jets.
Oh, they're gone. Oh gosh, what's the matter with me? My ignorance is coming out. Okay.
Oh, you're fine. Not a problem. Yeah, so they left back in 2011, and that was really a huge disappointment. I think some people didn't really see it coming. It was one of those where if you were deeply connected in Atlanta, you could see some of those signs showing. But if you didn't stay in tune with it, all of a sudden you look at the front page of the newspaper one day, and you're like, oh, gosh, what happened? Like, you know, where are they going? What's going on? But the writing was on the wall for a little bit of time.
And you said your father was from Buffalo. Did he talk to you much about the Bills playing in 4 straight Super Bowls and coming up short each time?
I haven't heard a ton about the Buffalo Bills because in my lifetime they haven't been very good, but lately, all of a sudden, my dad's been, staying in tune a little bit more with Buffalo, watching them because they've really given him more of something to watch. But to be honest with you, I haven't heard a ton of history on that Buffalo team yet.
From your father. Maybe he doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, I don't think he does. It's almost like maybe with my kids, I won't talk about that Super Bowl too often with the Falcons.
Yeah, actually, that's I think the most painful thing in American sports, losing 4 Super Bowls in a row, and just horrible. And so I always root for Buffalo, and I think they've had this. Yeah, so that, and I know the nice thing is when after I saw they did a ESPN thing, and they had They had a clip where the team was back after the Scott Norwood. They could have won it on a long field goal late, and this kicker Scott Norwood missed. It was pretty close, and the crowd was cheering for Scott Norwood. And I thought, wasn't that nice that that they had a good attitude about it. It's so important when we want to win, but there's different types of winning, and another being a good loser is winning. And giving people credit, especially if the guy felt so bad and they're giving him support. So that was really good. I really thought that was good.
Yeah, that's awesome. It kind of reminds me down here in Atlanta, one thing that a lot of people have mixed feelings on. I've actually done some interviews on my show with people that were involved in this, but Michael Vick's return to Atlanta, that was one of those where he got introduced after his Falcons career had ended. And he comes back in, I'm trying to think of what type of car. He's right in the back of a sports car with Roddy White, one of the former receivers in Atlanta. And they ride in, and Michael Vick says he comes out of the tunnel, and he's like, I didn't know if I was going to get cheered, booed, whatever, because of everything that happened in that situation. Being a great player, doing a terrible thing. What reception are you going to get? Turns out he got a good reception. He got a lot of claps. Of course, some boos, but things like that, when they reintroduce a former player, especially somebody that has both positive and negative emotions tied to it, can always be a fascinating thing to watch in sports.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because he was such an exciting player. And maybe the first of the running quarterbacks who are just so exciting. There's been a number of them, and the guy, you don't know what he's going to do, and it was really, and then it was tragic what happened. Yeah, he did something wrong, and then people were so hard on him. So I'm glad to hear that. I feel like we all make mistakes, and it also depends on our environment, and I think he was influenced to get into that, that dogfighting, probably from friends and so forth, or the culture where he lived, and so I'm glad to hear that they did that because we need to forgive, and I'm sure he went to prison. God, the poor guy. So he definitely paid for his crime, and so I'm glad to hear that that happened, that he was treated well in Atlanta after years later.
Yeah, and of course, if you want to, as I call it, kind of throw a grenade into a conversation, you can talk about that. There's more polarizing topics because down here it's one of those where you can toss it, like I say, kind of like a grenade. You don't know what's going to happen. There's, it's kind of a wild card. Maybe that's a better analogy for it. You toss a wild card there, and you say, okay, what do you think of Michael Vick? And then you get some people down here that are like, oh, he's the worst. Some people are like, yeah, he was bad, but he did his time, and he was a fun player. And you hear everything in between. It's still a very polarizing topic in Atlanta to the point where there's people like me that'll sit there and say, wow, I appreciate his playing career, but I have to separate it, on the field and off the field a little bit because I have to be able to say in a conversation, Michael Vick was a transcendent player. He was going to probably be a Hall of Famer if he didn't get himself in trouble. But with the dogfighting incident, it's like, well, these guys always say they're more than an athlete. And you look at Michael Vick, and, of course, they are more than athletes. There's a lot more to these guys and these players. And you say, well, for some people that's unforgivable. And I just have to separate it. I have to say, well, he's a great player, did a really bad thing with the dogfighting incident. And then I kind of let people go on about their opinions and explain because there's not maybe a right answer in that case of what you think, because he's did his time. He's raised a lot of money for animal shelters and tried to really get back on the right side of things, and people do get second chances. So it's a very polarizing topic in Atlanta, no matter how you cut it.
I was 1995. I was in the Philippines. I was out of touch. I didn't have cable TV. This is before internet, and I really couldn't follow the '95 Indians. But then I ended up, like the next year or some years later, getting a video of the the VHS video of the World Series. So I watched it over and over and over, and there was a lot of on Chipper Jones as a rookie. And here's a rookie wins the World Series, and I imagine when you were growing up, you saw Chipper Jones was a part of your childhood, rooting for the Braves because he had a long career and he's finally retired, right?
Exactly. Yeah, Chipper retired. Should have been after the 2012 season, I believe. And, yeah, he was the guy that every kid dressed up for Halloween as a baseball player, and they always had that number 10 with Jones on their back. Like, any kid that was part of the baseball culture on Halloween, like, you probably did that once in Atlanta. I think I dressed up as Chipper, like, 3 years in a row for Halloween, so tells you how creative I was. But with Chipper, he was one of those guys that you looked up to, that 300 hitter, could do anything on the field, coming through in clutch situations. I was actually at his final game in that wild card game, and that was wild, literally. But with Chipper, he was definitely the type of player that every kid in the city is looking up to, kind of the way that Freddie Freeman is now, especially now that he's won his MVP award. It's just the guy that you grow up and you're playing baseball in the backyard, and your dad or your friend throws you a pitch, and you're, boom, like Chipper Jones hit that to dead center. You're acting like you're Chipper in those situations. That's the type of player that he was for the city. That's why he's the first ballot Hall of Famer. And he inspired a lot of kids to get into baseball, the style that he played, the personality that he seemed to have and convey himself as kind of a light, fun guy. And so that's kind of how we saw him.
The time has flown by. We're out of time. Our guest has been Mr. Luke Winstel, who's a huge Atlanta sports talk talent, has a very bright future in the field of sports journalism. Luke, do you have any final words for our audience?
Well, final words are, first off, thank you for having me on the show. I've been very grateful to come on. Glad to get to speak with you all. But final words are just continue to fight through everything with the COVID pandemic. Keep your head up. I wish you all the best.
Well, wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Mr. Luke Winstel. Dear listener, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind beat your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Good night, everybody. Thanks again, Mr. Luke Winstel.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, very good.